Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd, and welcome to the last episode of the History of Hull Railways. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at the history of the Hull and Barnsley Railway, the last of Hull's railways. Now, I've left the story of the Hull and Barnsley Railway until last for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it was the last railway that was built in Hull. But more importantly, the other point is that it requires a lot of stage setting. You need to understand, for instance, the circumstances that led to the formation of the Hull and Barnsley Railway. The dominance, for instance, of every other line leading to Hull being owned by the North Eastern Railway. The fact that all of the docks were owned by the Hull Docks Company, and that double monopoly kind of put a lot of pressure on ship owners, merchants and industrialists in Hull. The North Eastern Railway was formed from the fallout of George Hudson's empire of companies. After his financial ruin, they were all in dire straits, but rather than destroy the rail network, an act was passed that forced them to amalgamate. And they did. And part of what they inherited were some docks in Tyneside, Middlesbrough and Hartlepool. And because of this massive monopoly that the North Eastern had, it was often accused by angry local business people and indeed Hull's own corporation of rate fixing and engineering locomotive shortages in order to avoid shipping the valuable traffic from Hull to the rest of the country. Now, there was certainly some rate fixing going on. The North Eastern Railway charged a colliery owner in South Yorkshire, for instance, exactly the same amount of money to ship their coal from there to Newcastle as they did from there to Hull, which was considerably closer. But there was a reason why colliery owners would rather send their coal to Newcastle, and it was all about, ultimately, profit. Hull's docks at that point were woefully out of date for handling coal in huge quantities. The docks at Goole and the docks at Newcastle were far better suited for that. Hull's docks, likewise, were all run by one company, the Hull Docks Company, and it was one of the chairmen of this firm, an ex-soldier called Gerard Smith, who expressed the highest outrage when, in 1872, the North Eastern Railway had such a bad locomotive shortage that trucks were left to stand for 2 days in the sidings of Priory Yard. The outcry over this compounded the many mutterings that the NER was abusing its monopoly to favour its own ports in Hartlepool and Middlesbrough, whilst the Conservative group within the Hull Docks Company was seeking to come to some kind of working arrangement with the NER, or even, possibly, a merger, something the more liberal elements in the Hull Dock Company thought could only deepen the monopoly and worsen the situation for merchants and ship owners in the city. And it was here, in 1879, the Royal Station Hotel, the North Eastern Railway's own Royal Station Hotel, so, deep in enemy territory there, that Gerard Smith and his backers had a meeting to outline their plans to break the domination of the North Eastern Railway and the Hull Docks Company. A key part of that was to build a new deep-water dock in the east of the city, Alexandra Dock, which would have state-of-the-art steam cranes and a brand new bleeding-edge coal system. The plan was to have it fed not from the North Eastern Railway, but from its own railway, the Hull and Barnsley, which would travel all the way around East Yorkshire and finish deep in the South Yorkshire coalfields, shuttling timber pit props in one direction and coal for export in the other. And the name of this new company? The Hull, Barnsley and West Junction Railway and Alexandra Dock Company. I'll just shorten it to Hull and Barnsley from here on. just to save the wear and tear on my mouth.
But Gerard Smith wasn't just on the board of the Hull Docks Company. On leaving the army, he joined the family firm, a bank, becoming a senior figure very quickly. He had no problems, therefore, getting financial backing or leaning on friends in high places. He maintained relations with senior members of Hull Corporation who'd been looking to break the NER's dominance in Hull for several years. The railway that Smith was promoting wasn't the first attempt. There had been plans to build a competing line into South Yorkshire in the mid-1840s, the Hull and Barnsley Junction Railway, but these weren't approved by Parliament. Again, after the outrage over the 1872 gridlock, a slightly madcap plan was hatched for another railway, the Hull South and West Junction Railway. This time, it would pass through a tunnel underneath the Humber, almost exactly where the modern-day Humber Bridge is. The North Eastern Railway engaged in a PR war to discredit the scheme, hiring an engineer to survey the plans and declare them ludicrous. This led Parliament to reject the plans.
But the Hull and Barnsley Railway and their backers, the Hull Corporation, were more than ready to meet these challenges. They already had a decent set of engineering plans for the line, and there were no serious hurdles to be overcome, such as bridging over or going underneath the Humber. But as they were looking for financial backing in Hull, they were faced with competition from a company that appeared from nowhere, the Hull and Huddersfield Railway Company, and the two firms engaged in a very public and quite bitter public relations war. Now, in the 21st century, we've started to discover that political groups and companies will hire PR firms to create vast armies of fake Facebook profiles and Twitter accounts in order to post on every news story that happens, in order to try and sway public opinion one way or another. And we think of that as a uniquely 21st century thing. After all, it's on the internet, it's social media. But this was happening in the 19th century. The Hull and Barnsley and the Hull and Huddersfield had armies of people writing into the local newspaper's letters page under pseudonyms like Black Diamond and Prophecy and Anti-Humbug, ridiculing the leadership of the companies or undermining the plans of the companies or mocking and ridiculing them. They even wrote and published poems that were mocking the chief instigators of the companies in what can only be described as Victorian diss tracks. But however the battle was fought, and it was viciously fought indeed, the Hull and Barnsley came out on top. They got their investment and they went before Parliament.
After a hard-fought debate with the North Eastern Railway and the Hull Docks Company before the Select Committee, the railway was awarded parliamentary approval in 1880, and construction of the line commenced. Within the city of Hull, the idea of making the railway a high-level line built on an embankment and crossing roads via bridges rather than level crossings was a masterstroke in helping to ensure local support. This was the 1880s, not the railway mania days of the 1840s and 50s. The cities were getting bigger, the road traffic was getting heavier as the industrial backbone of those cities grew increasingly dense. Constant hold-ups because of multiple level crossings on a road were never going to win popular industrial or political support, so the idea of building bridges over the city certainly played a role in getting the plans approved, although it very much increased the cost of building the line. Because Alexandra Dock was to be built on the east of the city, like Victoria Dock before it, the Hull and Barnsley line had to follow a similar route to the Victoria Dock branch line, looping around the outskirts of the city to begin its course westward. Looking at the route that it took shows just how much bigger the city had become in the 30 years between the building of the Victoria Dock branch line and the Hull and Barnsley high level line. Both ran on routes mostly outside the city boundaries when they were built, but certainly in West Hull, the two lines are widely separated, whilst in largely undeveloped East Hull, the lines ran side by side for a good stretch. These two lines are almost like tree rings in the outward expansion of the city of Hull.
To this day, most of the high-level line in Hull still exists, only it's now known as the Hull Docks line. And if you live in Hull, or you've been to Hull, chances are you've been under one of its many bridges, such as Heddon Road, Newbridge Road, Victor Street, Holderness Road, Danson Lane, or this footpath which follows the route of the old Fordyke stream, a drain, Stone Ferry Road, Bankside, Beverley Road, Maple Street, Princess Road, Chestnut Avenue, Newland Avenue, Jack Kay Walk, which follows the original route of the Cottingham Drain, Chanterlands Avenue, Perth Street West, the Bridlington Branch, Spring Bank, the Newington Branch, Anlaby Road, Boothbury Road.
Our journey begins at Alexandra Dock. Engine sheds were built here from the start to accommodate shunting locomotives, and a state-of-the-art coal loading system was built to allow the most efficient transfer of coal from wagons to ships. The line originally crossed Heddon Road and mingled momentarily with the tangle of the North Eastern Railways at Southcote's Junction, but the two railways never actually joined. On its way towards the river, just before it reached Stone Ferry Road, an interesting high-level spur junctions off the line here, just near Wilmington Station. In fact, originally Foster Street used to be sandwiched between these two embankments, the Victoria Dock branch line and this spur, which joined up with the Victoria Dock line. Yet every map that I find shows that the lines themselves never actually joined. This always seemed odd to me until I discovered that this whole spur was yet another spat in the ongoing early feud between the Hull and Barnsley and North Eastern Railways. There was apparently a provision here in the 1880 Act for a junction between the two railways, but the Hull and Barnsley realised halfway through building the spur that that would allow the NER to run to Alexandra Dock and take their business. This stopped construction, leaving the lines unjoined. The NER tried to force the issue with Parliament, but the Hull and Barnsley put in a stipulation that the NER could only run traffic on their line if it was not competitive. In other words, to destinations that were not reachable by the Hull and Barnsley and the lines it was partnering with in South Yorkshire. In what could only be described as a corporate huff, the NER dropped the case and the Hull and Barnsley just shrugged and the junction was never completed.
A little further on, the line crosses the River Hull on what were to be the first of many magnificent steel bowstring bridges. And it passed on the embankment, just behind me. And a bit further down, sidings flooded down from the embankment and filled this entire region in which I'm standing. And that is the Schullcoats goods yard, one of the largest goods yards in Hull. The Hull and Barnsley really hit the nail on the head with this place because it was right in the middle of dozens of companies like paint manufacturers and oil and cake mills and tanneries, all of whom wanted to ship their products out via the railway, and up until this point they'd been limited to the North Eastern Railway and their rates. This proved to be a very nice bit of competition. As an actual goods yard, it closed in the 1960s, but the site was rented, and during the 1970s and the late 60s it was used by Albert Draper and Son, a scrap merchant, as a breaker's yard. After the withdrawal of steam in 1968, this was a place where many steam locomotives met a grisly end under the cutter's torch. The photos of those old steam locomotives in various state of disassembly make for sad viewing, especially if you're one of the people who grew up with steam.
Heading further west, a branch left the embankment to the south to feed the Hull Corporation power station at Schullcoats, the main line driving across Barmston Drain between the ominous power station itself looming on one side like a dystopian Disney castle, and the giant wooden cooling towers on the other, later joined by an even larger concrete cooling tower. But before the line crossed Beverley Road, a spur left the main line and curved away south. Beverley Road Station used to stand here, just past the junction, but that was sadly demolished years ago. It was a 2-storey brick building, entered from the ground floor, and passengers would enter there, buy their tickets, go upstairs on a staircase, and walk out onto a platform on the embankment. The line bridged over Schullcoats Lane and flew over the Victoria Dock branch line and the Stepney goods yard on another bowstring bridge until it arrived at the Hull and Barnsley Railway's biggest passenger terminus in Hull, Cannon Street.
So I'm standing up here on the embankment that led down towards the Cannon Street station, which was over there, as it turns out. But I'm not going to walk down there because it's a little bit too overgrown for my liking. So I'm going to stand here with a backdrop of industrial Hull as it stands today and tell you the story of the station. You see, The original plan hadn't been to build a station at Cannon Street at all. What they'd built there was simply a wooden coach shed and a coal depot. The embankment ran along the side of that and was supposed to head right into the heart of Hull. Right to Kingston Square, in fact, where they were going to build a grand new terminus building to rival Paragon. But the money started to run out at that point, and for reasons that we'll go into later on in the video. Needless to say, a ban was put on the company purchasing any more land to run the railway on. And that was a problem for the station because they hadn't purchased the land between Cannon Street and Kingston Square. They had nothing to build their railway on. They had a big problem. So they were ingenious. The engineers took apart what they'd built of the embankment and instead ran the railway lines into the coach shed and turned that into Cannon Street Station. And that remained for the rest of its existence the Hull and Barnsley's terminus station in Hull. Must have been quite a disappointment really for the Hull and Barnsley Railway. I mean, they were counting on those first impressions being magnificent. Huge city centre station right in the heart of town, but instead what they got was a wooden coach shed in the middle of an industrial area full of factories and chimneys. Those first impressions count for a lot, unfortunately. Hull and Barnsley was never a prosperous line for passengers, and Cannon Street certainly didn't do very much business with them. Sadly, Cannon Street Station was never hugely popular, and after the amalgamation with the London North Eastern Railway in the 1920s, it was closed to passengers and turned into nothing more than a goods station. It remained so until its final closure in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and it was torn down shortly afterwards and replaced with an industrial unit, which in its turn has also been demolished. But one thing that is really nice is that the industrial unit, and now this branch of Hull College as well, have kept the original Cannon Street Station gates with the Hull and Barnsley identifier on the metalwork itself, which is kind of lovely.
Back on the main line, it carried on westward and south across Newland Avenue, Chanterlands Avenue and Springbank to a large three-way junction. Here, the route south headed back east to the company's enormous goods station at Albert and William Wright Dock, known as the Neptune Street Goods Station. This station still stood until 2019, covered up with metal cladding, and it was only revealed in its full glory briefly in the spring of 2019, just before demolition work began. Fortunately, I managed to capture some footage before this wonderful piece of railway history was gone forever. In this footage it's half demolished, but you can still get a sense of the scale of this vast building and the very Victorian styling. Back to the three-way junction, heading west, the main line continued on its journey out of the city, but here the line branched off, crossing Calvert Lane on 3 separate bridges. One carrying the main line and the other 2 carrying traffic to the goods yard that spread out next to Calvert Lane to the south. As you can see, whilst the bridges are long gone, the support still exists on the east side of the road, and the embankment carries on westward. The goods yard remained, although with no rails, until well into the 2000s. I remember passing this way myself every day on my way to college as a teen in the 1990s and seeing the old yard laying bare and empty. These days, it's a housing development, rather aptly named The Sidings.
So if we carry on up the embankment, which does sound like a slightly dodgy carry-on film, they're all slightly dodgy, then we eventually come to what used to be the Springhead Depot, which was the Hull and Barnsley's main motive power depot in Hull. Sure, there were engine sheds at Alexandra Dock, but they were nothing compared to Springhead. And whilst it may itself have not been a blip on the radar when it comes to the massive dairy coats, it was still quite substantial, with plenty of engine sheds and huge amounts of goods sidings, and even a coal plant. Sadly, when the grouping came up in the 1920s and it was absorbed into the LNER, there were forces at work, shall we say, who had been North Eastern Railway people who'd perhaps not really liked the Hull and Barnsley Railway, and they jumped at the chance to close the place down, seeing it as duplicated infrastructure. It was used as nothing more than to store coaches from the 1920s up until the 1950s, when British Rail started to use it to store diesel multiple units. But they were all moved to Botanic Gardens in the 1960s, and without a purpose, the whole place was razed to the ground and the track was lifted. Springhead now consists of a playing field and a housing development, and nothing really stands to show you that once upon a time this was one of Hull's biggest locomotive works.
Along this stretch, there were a couple of vanished stations. Springhead Halt was the smallest, opened in 1929 after the line was absorbed by the mighty LNER, but closed in 1955. It consisted merely of a pair of wooden platforms. Willoughby and Kirkella Station, however, was older and more substantial, feeding these well-established suburbs of Hull since the line's opening in 1885, and only closing in 1955 as British Rail began the process of closing down the line to reduce costs. Onwards through Willoughby the line goes. These days the trackbed here is followed perfectly by the line of the B1232 road as it heads towards the roundabout junction with the A164. Across the roundabout, the old trackbed has been used by an aggregate firm in order to move material from quarries and farms without having to use the roads. So from here up to Little Wheaton, some of the infrastructure remains, including bridges and the embankment.
So as we head out of Hull, the question has to be asked: why did the Hull and Barnsley Railway go through the only hills in East Yorkshire? Why didn't they just go around them the way that the Hull and Selby Railway had done years before? Well, as with everything, the answer is a little more political. And what actually happened was, when the Hull and Selby Railway line 45 years earlier had built their stretch of line, the only way you could get from Hull to the West Riding without going through the Wolds was to pass through a tiny bottleneck in the area around Brough and Ferriby. And the landowners there cottoned on to the fact that any railway that was going to be built needed to go through them. And they sat back and demanded huge cash settlements, which unfortunately the Hull and Selby Railway pretty much had to give them. The Hull and Barnsley was already being costly. They didn't want to run the risk of having to settle with landowners, so they headed to the Wolds, and their engineers and surveyors had gone on ahead and said that they think we found a way through. We found an easy way through. It'll be fine. Everything's going to be fine. It wasn't fine. The land the surveyors had seen that they thought was a solid chalk base turned out not to be. And unfortunately, by the time they found this out, the line was already well under construction, so they were committed to a route through the Wolds. And unfortunately, because of that, the route through the Wolds ended up having to be a route through the Wolds.
The line passes by the small village of Little Wheaton, and the beautiful station building here remains as a private residence, sadly not easily visible from the road. Just before the station, we see the start of the railway's attempt to pass through the Wolds, and we begin to see just why they ran out of funding. The Little Wheaton cutting was massive, and 83 foot deep at one point. The bridges that crossed it high above the line were an iconic image of the Hull and Barnsley Railway for years. The bridge has long gone, and even the site where it stood has vanished as the cutting has slowly been consumed by landfill. At this point, I'm standing pretty much where one side of the bridge would have gone across, looking up the cutting, across the cutting, and down the cutting. Nothing's left. Landfill has completely obliterated Little Wheaton cutting and the accommodation bridge. But this wasn't the most expensive part of the line. Not by a long way. That award has to go to this, Drewton Tunnel. Over a mile long and with several huge ventilation shafts poking up in the middle of fields on the top of the chalk hills, It was a back-breaking labour to create, and not just for the navvies who built it, some of whom died or were seriously injured in its construction, but it certainly broke the back of the company. They had expected to make expensive tunnels in South Yorkshire and had budgeted for them, but these workings took them well over their limit.
These unanticipated tunnels, like the enormous Drewton, and the smaller tunnels known locally as Weedley and Sugarloaf, contributed enormously to inflating the cost of the line, making it one of the most expensive railway lines in the entire country per mile of track. It clocked up an average price per mile of £59,000, and that was in the 1880s. In modern money, that equates to £7.5 million per mile. Per mile of track on a railway that was 60 miles long. That's a lot of money, and the debts were mounting into the millions of pounds even in Victorian money. Unfortunately, by 1884 the problem had gotten so bad that construction had to be stopped, until finally the Hull and Barnsley Railway went cap in hand in front of Parliament to beg for the debts to be allowed until the building work had been complete.
This financial hiccup caused no end of problems for the company. We've already seen how their plans for a grand terminus in Kingston Square were thwarted, but more importantly, it meant that the line as a whole never quite reached Barnsley, instead terminating at Cudworth with a link to Stairfoot only a few miles from its original destination, thus rendering the very company's name as an inescapable reminder of its hubris in trying to cross the wolds.
But there's such beauty in this stretch of track. I've been to some really nice places in my life. I've been to the Isle of Skye, I've been to Catalonia, I've been to Snowdonia and the Yorkshire Dales, but this remains possibly one of my favourite places in the entire world. Why? Well, look at it. It's a place where an abandoned railway once passed through some of the most dramatic scenery in all of East Riding. It went through valleys and through hills and past forests, under bridges and through tunnels. And it's still somehow the landscape seems to echo with the forlorn sounds of old steam whistles. Not something you can hear, but something you feel in your bones. And it's the place where I first fell in love with abandoned railways. And 25 years ago, when I passed my driving test, it was here that I made my very first solo car journey. It's wonderful, and I love it. Another contributor to the Hull and Barnsley Railway's debts was the fact that they didn't exactly skimp out when it came to building stations. As you can see from this one at South Cave, it's grand, huge. It's like a mansion building rather than a small agricultural way stop like the ones that we've seen on the Hull and Hornsey and Hull and Withensea routes. Built in a fantastic Queen Anne revival style, the Hull and Barnsley Railway wanted to put out the image that it wasn't just the equal of the North Eastern Railway. In many ways, it was actually going to be better.
In spite of all the problems that we've covered, the Hull and Barnsley Railway finally opened in 1885. But things weren't all smooth sailing. A rates war between themselves, the NER and the Hull Dock Company slashed their anticipated income, and by 1887 they were seeking an amalgamation with another railway, the Midland Railway, but this was vetoed by several shareholders. The company went into receivership until 1889 when its debts were finally paid off and the line began to actually make money. A few years later, the North Eastern Railway and the Hull Docks Company finally merged. But there was a proviso in place in the Act of Parliament for the merger that when they built a new dock that they'd already planned, later to be known as King George Dock, they must approach the Hull and Barnsley Railway for consent and to run the dock jointly if the Hull and Barnsley so wished. The now relatively financially well-balanced Hull and Barnsley jumped at the chance to have a stake in another dock. By the early 1900s, the debts had been dealt with and the company actually issued modest dividends to its shareholders. They gained running powers on several South Yorkshire railway lines, extending their reach deeper into the coalfields. And it was at this time that they finally changed their company name from the cumbersome Hull, Barnsley and West Riding Junction Railway and Alexandra Dock Company to the much more memorable Hull and Barnsley Railway. King George Dock was built in the early 1900s, and they worked with the North Eastern Railway, the latter company reworking a stretch of the Withensea branch into a junction with the Hull and Barnsley High Level line just before the Alexandra Dock branch. Things were looking good. The Hull and Barnsley Railway had taken on Goliath, almost been beaten, but had survived and came out swinging. By 1922, they were one of only a handful of small local railway companies still left standing, most others having been absorbed by increasingly large companies like the Great Western or the South Eastern. But the end was nigh. The Great Grouping was in the air, and in 1922, Parliament issued an act that forced the Hull and Barnsley Railway, along with other smaller companies across the North East, to amalgamate with the NER, and then in the following year, the NER itself was amalgamated with other large companies to form the London and North Eastern Railway, the LNER. It, along with the London Midland Scottish, the Southern and the Great Western, became the only players in the country. The age of the Big Four had begun. The first thing the LNER did was to eliminate duplicated track and assets, and certain ex-North Eastern Railway heads who'd become London North Eastern Railway heads, who had a long-standing grudge against the Hull and Barnsley Railway, ensured that stretches of their old competitor were first to go. Sadly, this meant a huge amount of the Hull and Barnsley line was closed in the 20s. Cannon Street and Beverley Road stations were closed to passengers, though Cannon remained open to freight until the 1950s. And the Springhead Depot was decommissioned and used to store coaching stock. The locomotives of the railway were sent to Dairycoats or the breakers' yards. Some of the engines that survived worked the seaside branch lines in later years. After nationalisation was completed in the late 1940s, most of the rest of the line was closed, including, controversially, the stretch through the Wolds. This effectively cut off villages like Little Wheaton and South and North Cave, as replacement bus services that were promised were few in number and inadequately slow compared to the trains. Slowly, piece by piece, the legacy of the Hull and Barnsley Railway was dismantled, with Springhead finally closing in the late 1950s. Neptune Street Goods Station, after years of also being rented by Draper's scrap merchants and also been used to cut up old locomotives, closed in the 1970s, and the line was gradually lifted. The original Neptune Street branch instead merging with the Hull and Selby line just north of the Hessel Road flyover. The magnificent swing bridge across the Ouse at Long Drax lay permanently opened and lifeless until it was dismantled in the 1970s. Of all the extensive network of the company, all that remains today is the high-level line around Hull from King George Dock, which still transports coal, but in the other direction, from ships that bring it in from Europe to the power station at Drax. Somewhat ironically, the stretch of reopened railway that serves Drax Power Station is also part of the old Hull and Barnsley line. With the high-level docks line, however, despite all attempts to destroy the railway, the legacy of the rebel company that sought to break the stranglehold on the monopolies in Hull's docks and railways is quite literally held aloft and lives on, those bridges and embankments held fixed in the hearts and memories of generations of Hull people. There can be few locals who don't still feel a slight excitement when they see a freight train rumbling over those bridges. Even though they may not know the name of Hull and Barnsley Railway, they know the line. It's baked into their heritage. This concludes the first series of History of Hull. In it, we've seen how the railways completely transformed the lives of the people of Hull at every level. From working class people who discovered a use for their newfound leisure time by visiting the seaside at Hornsey, Withensea and Bridlington, to the factory owners, farmers, merchants and ship owners who profited enormously from the ability to move their wares across the country to the massive industrial centres of the West Riding and the Midlands. It brought Hull industry, jobs and fish and chips. It brought us seaside holidays, commuter suburbs and a huge city, fed by a constant string of trains from the countryside. And more than that, before the railways, Britain had really just been a collection of local communities with no real sense of the rest of the nation. People grew up, lived and died locally. They ate local food, drank local beverages, and often worked the same jobs their parents had done. The only people who really understood Britain as a nation were politicians and the aristocracy and certain large companies. The coming of the railways shrank the country in much the same way that the internet would shrink the world 150 years later. National news was something that previously had spread slowly across the country over weeks before the coming of the railways, and within only 20 years, someone in Hull could read that morning's newspaper from London whilst eating their breakfast. People started to travel across the country, seeing new places and new ways of doing things. They traded and started eating food brought in from across the country, building with materials from all over the UK. The railways knit the country together as a tangible country for the working people for the very first time in history. And it's telling that all of that railway building happened in the blink of an eye. In Hull, there was a 50-year window when all the city's rail network was constructed, and nothing new was built since. The 20th century was the age of road-building lobbyists who whispered in the ears of politicians of the benefits of scrapping rail and promoting car ownership and road haulage. And the once mighty railways were pruned savagely and, in many cases, irreversibly. And yet, in the 21st century, more people than ever are travelling by train than at any point in history. Passenger congestion has become such an issue that new bigger trains have finally started to be brought onto the network to relieve the pressure. Meanwhile, overcrowded roads choke into gridlock, full of oversized cars and lorries ill-suited for British roads.
So here is the end of our line. Up there is the embankment that the railway passed on, and all the way along down there towards the River Ouse, towards the Long Drax swing bridge which took it into the West Riding. In fact, if you see over there, you can see the cooling towers of Drax Power Station on the other side of the river. And the reason our journey ends here today is because the Hull and Barnsley is an enormous line, and it stretches all the way down to the coalfields of South Yorkshire, and there are more tunnels and more bridges and more cuttings to explore. But we don't have time for that, because if I did, this video would be longer than the Lord of the Rings director's cut with added orcs. So I'm going to call it a day here, because this is basically the history of Hull's railways. However, don't panic. I know you love the Hull and Barnsley Railway. I know it's one of the most popular ones in the region. There will be a kind of a part 2 next year. I'm going to actually be doing a new series that's going to run alongside the history of Hull called The Lost Railways of Yorkshire, and one of the first ones I want to do is the rest of the Hull and Barnsley. So stay tuned.